Alright, I'm going to set up my render layers now. Setting up render layers is pretty straightforward, although if you prefer you could always use render passes. I'm just going to go with render layers. Now I've created a couple of extra lights for myself just to save time, just to refine the look of everything. Alright, so I'm going to set up my my render layers, and obviously I want to sort of think what my strategy is. In this case I think it's going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to want a layer for the wall, a layer for the M4 machine gun, a layer for my bullet particles, a layer for my craters, and a layer for the sparks. Yeah, so I'll set that up. So let's see, I'll start with the wall. So I'm going to select the wall, and the lights, I'm just going to go with my default couple of lights here, my directional light sun and dome, and click on the create layer, render layer button. Actually, before I do that, I just want to check one thing. I just want to make sure that in the default situation, yeah, let's see, I'm rendering using mental ray, quality, production motion blur. Yep, I want to render this with motion blur. For at least one of the layers I'm going to turn motion blur off, but for the rest I'm going to go with motion blur. Alright, so I'm looking good. Alright, so the wall, I'm going to select the wall geo, a couple of lights, create my layer. Very important that as you create these, you name them. There's my wall layer. Come back to the master layer. When I'm creating render layers, I always like to start from the master layer position. It's a bit superstitious of me, but a few years back I found that this may have been corrected now, but I found a few years back that if you didn't create a render layer by having the master layer selected, you could run into problems with connections. But who knows? Maybe that's just me being superstitious. Alright, so that's my wall layer, my crater layer. Let's see, I'm going to select my geo, creator instancer, and my lights. So, sun. I've got a light here, crater dome and crater fill, which I created for myself. Pop them in there, and the nice thing about let's see, make sure that everything's in there. Yep, there we go. Nice thing about working with render layers, obviously, is the fact that you can adjust your lighting to suit. I am going to make sure that these guys are out of frame. Let me just pop them down there. There we go. Lovely. Okay, back to master layer. Wall layer, crater layer, M4 layer. Yes, definitely want to see the machine gun. Alright, so for the M4 layer, I'm going to select the M4, and I'm going to select the dome light. I'm also going to select the M4 rim and the M4 light. And again, just because they look a little nicer than the other lights. And create my layer. And we'll call this M4. Oh, I didn't name this one. This is my crater layer. Crater layer. Oops. It's M4. Okay, we're looking pretty good here. Now my layers from my particles. Alright, so I want to have a bullet layer. So now if we come forward here a bit, so now I can see my bullet coming out. So I'm going to select my bullet. Now I don't need any lights for this layer, but I do want the M4 to be in this, because you notice that at some points, like a frame like this, we can see here's my bullet particle, but it's being covered, most of it, by the gun, so I want to make sure that my M4 is in there. Now obviously there's a couple of different ways I could approach this in terms of the render, but I want to keep it pretty simple now, so I'm just going to put it all in there. Alright, so select my bullet particle, my M4, create my layer, and I'll call this bullet layer. Now for the bullet layer, I want things to be a little different. I don't want the same texture on here. So I'm going to assign a new material. I'm going to assign a surface shader, and I'm going to set the matte opacity down to 0 because I don't want the alpha rendering from this. I just want the gun to cover my particle. Now, one other thing. I've got motion blur turned on for all my other layers, which works great. The only thing is, for the bullet here, if we take a look here, let's actually render this frame. The bullet, because it's moving so fast, if we render it with motion blur, it tends to disappear. So I'm actually going to render just this layer without motion blur. The tube particle type already sort of simulates the appearance of motion blur anyways. So there we can see there's my bullet, but it's it's there, but it's kind of disappearing. Especially if you look at the alpha, we can see that it's just a little. There's our alpha. It's pretty clear, but yeah, I'm just worried about it disappearing. So what I'm going to do for this layer, open the render globals, and for just this layer, I'm going to come down and I'm going to right mouse button click here and select create layer override and turn this off, which is cool. Nice flexible thing. So now if I render just this layer, now we can see don't have motion blur there, and my bullet looks nice and sharp now. And so now if we go to say frame 13 and we render, we should see, yeah, just the tip of the bullet coming out. And if we look at the alpha, we see we're not getting any alpha from our gun, but the gun is covering our bullet there, so that's looking good. Cool. And now lastly, I want my sparks. Anything else in there? And same thing, I want to include the gun, just in case. I don't really think there's any frames. Nah, but just as a matter of policy, I'm going to put the M4 in there. Call this sparks layer. This layer I am going to render with motion blur. I could turn it off, but what the heck? Like if we take a look at this, if we render this frame, the sparks, they're meant to just be sparks. They they're not that central. If they don't read super clearly, I'm not too worried about it. And obviously in comp I could make them clear anyways. So I think that's good. So I'll go with motion blur on that one. So yeah, so I'm pretty much set to go there. So I've set up my render layers, and I'll save this, save scene as. And I'll call this Impact 4. Ready to render. And start my render. Oh, and yeah, just make sure that each of my render layers is checked on, and I'll start the render.